welcome to the 23rd edition of Encounters in 2021, and to our panel that's discussing co-productions across Africa and how we start moving these forward. My name is THANDI Davids. I'm moderating this panel, and I'm happy to start introducing our panel members. Let me start with Stephen MARKOVITZ. Stephen has over 25 years experience producing feature films, documentaries, and is based in Cape Town. He's the co-founder of the Big World Cinema in 1994, Encounters in 1999, so it's very close to Encounters' heart, and Electric South in 2005. He's also a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. Hi, Stephen. Hi.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks. Our next panelist is Jean-Marie TENO, who's based in France and originally from Cameroon. He's been producing for over 30 years, producing and directing for over 30 years with the focus of issues of race, cultural identity, African history, and contemporary politics. Hi, Jean-Marie. Good, you mute at the moment. Hi, still mute. There we
hello,
go.
hello.
Thanks so
Hello,
much,
thank
Jean-Marie.
you. Yeah.
Our fourth panelist is Ramadan SULEMAN, who's based in Johannesburg. He is a director, writer, and producer for over 30 years. Is well respected for his role for producing over 30 young filmmakers, producing their first films, and is also very well respected in terms of dealing with industry issues in South Africa around transformation and emerging producers. Our last panelist is SAITABAO, KAIYARE, based in Nairobi, producing documentaries and TV shows. He's also a director at the Baruu Collective, which is active in the conservation of African history. And let's start off by talking about co-producing on this continent. I want to starting with Jean-Marie. Can we talk a little bit about how often you've co-produced and which countries you've co-produced with over your 30-year career?
That's a very interesting question, because I believe that we don't co-produce with countries. I produce with producers, with people, with individuals, and with particular stories. And coming from a country where the industry is not really structured, we have some, how do you say, agreements with France, because I'm based both in France and in Cameroon. The natural way I've been co-producing was co-producing my own work, actually, from between Cameroon and France. And most of the films that I do when I'm raising fundings in Europe, when I do the production locally in Cameroon, it's just like a conversation with myself most of the time. But in 2000, I produced a film from Benin by a young director called Idrissou Morakpai. And that was just, I think it was a political statement, because a young filmmaker approached me and asked me for help. And I didn't know how I could help him more than accompanying him on the process of making his film. And that's how I ended up producing his film. And we did a co-production between France, Germany, because he was based in Germany at the time, and Benin, his country of origin. That was my first really serious attempt in co-producing. And I raised money mostly in Europe for that fund. And of course, there are all the funds that are dedicated to African cinema, with Francophonie, with the ACP. All these funds were funds that we could tap into to produce the film, actually. But I've never really had a co-production from starting a project with people. I was having an interaction in terms of the content. Yes, I never really had this kind of interaction apart from this experience, this first experience that I had, and now I'm producing young filmmakers in a training-based program called Heritage in Cameroon.
Okay, great. Ramadan, can you enlighten us into your work across the continent, your collaborations with filmmakers in other countries, where you've worked, to give us some background on your engagement with the continent?
Well, hi everyone. My journey with the continent, it dates back to in the 80s, mid 80s. But the real co-production working with an African producer started for me about plus minus 12 to 15 years ago, whereby I had this privilege of being commissioned by the Algerian Ministry of Arts and Culture. Mine was a very strange experience because it was the Ministry of Culture in Algeria that commissioned me to actually do a documentary celebrating African liberation movements from Algeria when it started its liberation armed struggle against France in 1954 to South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994. So the idea was to look at that whole period. And I was then asked to find, very strangely again, I was asked to select a producer in Algeria that I would be comfortable to work with, which again was interesting. I wasn't imposed a producer, and I was given a certain amount in terms of budget, which budget I could use in South Africa. The condition, which again was unique, was that I was not to go to Europe and seek funding. I was only allowed to seek funding in the continent. And unfortunately, coming to South Africa, it took so much energy and gray hairs on me to try to convince the South African entities to be co-producers, and it took a while before South Africa entered into the co-production. However, a treaty, an MOU, which we have to admit is a useless paper, was signed between the NVF and Algeria in 2009. And as usual, for all of us, nothing comes of all these MOUs. And yeah, the working relationship between me and the Algerian producers and the government was quite unique again for me in the continent, where I was given free access to the Algerian archives. I was for the first time treated like a very high diplomat. All I needed to do was to say, I want to speak to so-and-so, I want to speak to so-and-so, and all that was free access, to a point of even interviewing the first Algerian president, Ahmed Ben Bella. But unfortunately, which is the other way around, which we South Africans tend to complain, is that we don't have access in the continent, but I did not have access in South Africa.
Yeah.
I could, to interview officials who were involved in the liberation movement was zilch.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so for me, it was a very strange, very strange experience. Whereas we would tend to complain to say that, no, we don't have partners in the continent. And yet I had partners, but I couldn't have access in my own country. And that was a revelation for me in terms of how we South Africans take seriously the whole idea of co-production. And I'm sure this was, to conclude, discussed yesterday in a meeting, that South Africa does not have a treaty with any African country. So this discussion is very interesting when we talk about co-production, when politically there seems to be no willingness to allow South Africans to collaborate with the continent. Yeah, so I'll stop there for now.
For sure. I think part of this discussion, which I know is happening here and other platforms, is that South Africa is trying to enter into co-production agreements with Nigeria, Algeria, and Kenya. And with that, I'd like to kind of move on to SAITABAO. If you could give us a little bit of input into, whether you've managed to do any co-productions across the continent and with which countries, and if there have been any sticking points and ideas around that.
Hello, hi. First of all, I'd like to say I'm actually relatively new when it comes to co-production. So I recently did my first co-production. However, it was not with another African country. It was based between Kenya and Germany. So I was able to raise funds from Germany, but also I had the initiative where I needed to raise more funds, especially locally in Kenya. And this was through now organizations such as DocuBox East Africa. So right now I'm still working in development, 2 projects that I'm currently working on. And the projects kind of cut across between different African countries. So it's like what Ramadan said, there are issues when it comes to treaties and agreements where you find it's like the Wild Wild West. There's no structure in form. So for me personally, we have to use organizations such as, Documentary Africa to, find different producers from different African countries.
Okay. Thank you. Stephen, your thoughts on also some background in terms of your working on the continent and what has been good and what has not been so good, and where you've worked, and some thoughts on this?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was just, when you asked the other panelists the question, I was trying to think what productions I've done. I was writing it down on the back of an envelope. And between feature films, documentaries, and shorts and VR pieces, what I can count here, I've worked on over 20 projects co-producing with other African countries, 21, but there might be others. And the countries I've worked with include Egypt, Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, DRC, Tanzania, Kenya, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And I think that for me, it's a kind of political act to want to co-produce with other African countries, with other talented directors and producers from the rest of the continent. Because I think, I've said it a few times, is I think that, if you look at the history of African cinema over the last 60 years, you will see the ownership patterns of those films are mainly in France or in Europe, etc. And so the control over those films are mainly outside of Africa. And I think until we work more together and try and retain majority ownership of our films, I think we are going to continue to see that ownership impacting on the kind of creative direction of films also. So I think it's important politically and economically to co-produce. And in my experience, when I've co-produced with other filmmakers from other countries, I agree with Jean-Marie, it's not really about a national identity, it's more about people who want to work together and believe they can collaborate, you know, in a positive way together, regardless of where they're from. I think filmmaking is a kind of, it should be, and for me it is a kind of borderless activity. And so I think when we've co-produced, we generally try and pool ourselves together as African-based producers as one unit, and then go out into the world to try and bring other partners on board. So we act as a united front, and we pool our ownership to try and, you know, get a higher percentage of ownership of the film. And generally, we always operate as a unit, regardless of which countries we're from.
Great, Stephen. So just in terms of your chat now, I think one of the points I wanted to talk about was, will these collaborations across the continent really assist us in conserving our own African culture? You know, we know as those of us who've made documentaries, we very often have to leave the continent to access our own archive, because as you were saying, they sit in foreign countries and foreign libraries, and they don't sit here. Do we believe this is an opportunity as we start to work together more as Africans and African filmmakers? This allows us the ability to be able to conserve our stories and tell our stories in ways that are more meaningful for us, and without the eye of a Western master, if I could put it that way, in our storytelling. Let me start with you, Stephen, and then hand over to Ramadan from there.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to go first, but I will go. I think absolutely. I think that that the kind of control is absolutely key, that the director has creative control and is working with producers who are supporting and protecting her or him. So I think it absolutely makes a huge difference. And I think this is actually quite a positive era we're in, because I know there was a panel yesterday with film funds. And I think, you know, if you look at the number of film funds that will support African projects outside of their borders, there's more funds now than there ever has been. It's certainly, like in the last 3-4 years, it's really grown. It's off a low base. We've got a long way to go, but there are really positive signs. And I think for a very long time, over the last 100 years of cinema, you've seen, you know, images on Africa have been dominated by the West. And I think that, you know, African directors need to to shift that narrative, and they can't do that on their own. They need to work with producers who can help kind of protect that space.
Thanks. And Ramadan, I mean, you've had experience, you know, talking about a story across the continent in various countries. How important is this move to work together? How important is it for ensuring our own cultural conservation?
For me, to conserve our culture, I suppose I find that a contentious issue, because at the end of the day, culture, as we all know, is a dynamic phenomenon, right? So it's something which is always challenged. But I do agree that us working with, collaborating with African producers and filmmakers is quite important. At the end of the day, I do believe that, to answer you, yes, to conserve our heritage per se, it makes it much easier when an African, or what others would call South-South collaboration, is actually emphasized. But at the same time, the handicap we all know when it comes to archives, heritage. Our heritage in the African continent are in shambles, right? Whether you talk of Kenya, whether you talk of South Africa, whether you talk of any other country, they are really in shambles. We, for example, in South Africa, are having to go to Britain or to France or to Germany to purchase our heritage from those countries. And at the same time, if an African filmmaker is wanting to collaborate with a South African filmmaker to access South African heritage for their story, our public broadcaster is not a friendly partner to all of us, right? I mean, and this is applicable to even South Africans. Whether you are making a heritage project or cultural project which is African, our public broadcaster is going to give you a rate which is BBC or French broadcaster rate. So these are for me the challenges in trying to determine our own stories. But I do agree that in order to protect ourselves, to conclude, the South-South collaboration is paramount. I've had an experience whereby I was doing something African, and here was a Belgian producer insisting on me putting in an African dictator into the story. Whereas I'm saying, but that's not my story. My story is about this ABCD. I mean, I was doing Miriam Makeba, for example, and they were insisting on highlighting Sekou Toure as a dictator in the story. So you end up with those conflicts. Whereas if you are working with an African producer of filmmaker, they will understand those kinds of perspectives.
Great. Jean-Marie, your thoughts on this? And with a specific reference, I think, you know, across the continent, we don't always work across our language bases. I know Suleiman will refer to it as the colonist language bases, but there they are. We have common languages that have been left behind here. So in terms of this cultural conservancy, how do we also try to work and collaborate across language bases on this continent to ensure that when we speak and when we share our histories, we are not being prevented by doing so because of language specifically?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but I really want to jump back to the question that you raised before, because why do we co-produce actually? Because the first question is, why do we co-produce? Co-producing is probably having more money for a film or more spaces to show the film. We are witnessing now some very interesting phenomenon with the funds that exist in Europe, and they are almost imposing and pushing African countries to go into co-production. So a fund that you could apply and get, let's say, a certain amount of money. If you have a partner in the neighboring country or in another zone of the continent, they will double that fund because you are having a co-production. So now you are entering a very kind of strange thing that you have a film that you don't have, there is no input, no creative input, but you have to co-produce because it's a trend. If you want to have more money, you find a co-producer and you come together and you spend time doing a lot of administrative work that is not probably all necessary and at the end, I don't even know if people are not writing or transforming their stories to fit into this kind of mishmash co-production. And I'm not sure whether these are going to help us make better films, or are we just spreading and just saying we have been doing co-productions. And so every single project now, you have a producer from Senegal, a producer from Cameroon, or producer, and we are coming together. And when you are reading, you don't see what is the real input that this coming together is bringing. I can understand that for fiction, for instance, because you need a huge platform of money. But for documentary, suddenly you are there and not even technicians coming from over the place because you don't have all the technical crew. We need to really think, why is it that now every single project that you see coming from a young producer, he needs to have his friends from Burkina Faso all coming together to co-produce, when maybe there is no need for that, and the budget are just getting bigger, and yet you are not really seeing what this is bringing into the project. And suddenly you are getting into a kind of standardized documentary, because everyone wants to make the films that looks like the film that are having some success. And so you need also to ask that question. And not co-producing is not, if you have a film that is dealing with a story that have a legitimacy to go across the borders and to deal with issues that are relevant to many different countries, that's really a film that calls for co-production. But you have some film that doesn't even call for that. So can we also think of what is the co-production? Why are we really co-producing if it's only to get a little more money? And sometimes that you have to spend and justify and spend maybe months trying to find ways to make the figures match to send it back to these people. So that is also a relevant question, because cinema, what we are here, we are filmmakers, we are here to try to make film and hopefully to make better films. That's
so just to ask you, I mean, are you alluding to the fact that in fact, as we start co-producing more, because these budgets are being directed from Europe, let's say largely on the continent, that it's impacting the way we're telling stories because of where those budgets are coming from and where they're insisting on those stories being told, that it's impacting the kinds of stories that we should be telling, and it's not happening naturally, that the money's almost forcing relationships as opposed to relationships being created themselves?
Well, I'm glad that Ramadan is here with me. I've been making films for the last 30 something years. And when I want to tell a story, I manage to tell the story I want to tell. Probably, and because I work hard enough to really know what I want to say and to stick to what I want to say, I can make, of course, we make compromises, but there are some level of compromises I'm not ready to take. And my experience with producing younger filmmakers is always trying to define what is their vision and see how we can stick as much as possible to the vision they have, instead of letting everyone bring different outputs, different inputs to transform the story into what they call the story that is fit for the international market. For me, I think that the international market has space for different individual visions, and these visions are the one thing that make cinema grow, actually, and not because we are just repeating what seems to have worked at one point. So I don't really think it's the fact that you are co-producing with Europe that impacts this kind of story that you are free to accept or not to accept. So, but if you choose to accept, the film that you're going to end up with is the film that you deserve. So I don't really see that as an issue. And the fact that we are co-producing between African countries, when the funders are imposing this kind of forced alliances, they are also almost imposing in these commissions the kind of stories that they want to support. So at one point, it's just a catch-22, because this funding have people who are there defending a certain vision of cinema, and they are not having in these boards people who can allow people to be creative, to be free, and to really tell stories that are challenging everything that was there before. You have people who just say, oh, we are not seeing in your proposal your film. But if you can see the film in a proposal, why make a film? You just give the proposal and that's enough. I mean, you make a proposal because it's a proposition, and suddenly people say, oh, we are reading your proposal, but we're not seeing the film. How can you want to see the film on the text? People have also to have imagination to see the perspective, the prospects.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. Thanks. I want to move on to SAITABAO. let's keep with this issue around financing and funding films. You're a young producer, as you've said to us. You're in the process of developing a number of films that will be filmed across more than one country. How are you finding the funding regimes for working across border on films? So as you go through this development process, as you start to create and make these films, what are the obstacles you're encountering? What have you found is helpful in terms of your process at this point in time?
Yeah, of course. When especially embarking on the very beginning of like research stages of creating this kind of films, some of the challenges, first of all, especially when it cuts across different African countries, you'll find mostly language barrier, like we said, because also the fact that most African countries still rely heavily on, let's say, languages such as English, Portuguese, and French. Trying to cut across the authentic African languages, that's one challenge. And also trying to navigate culturally, because, for example, I from Kenya will find it culturally different, let's say, to South Africa. So also trying to understand the landscape per se. So this is where co-production is very important. For example, having, let's say, a producer from South Africa who he or she understands the country better in a better perspective, also allows in a creative input, also in creative producing, and makes it easier, for example, in terms of telling the narrative story to its efficiency and effectiveness in order to achieve that. So those are some of the challenges, but also the main challenges, like we've been talking about, it's always the financing. And you find a lot of the financing comes from, European countries. And even though it's being trickled down to, let's say, local organizations or local, you still find where, as filmmakers, we have a sort of blueprint, because we always think about how the target market, we always make assumption the international target audience. So we have a blueprint in mind of the cliches of what we want to present as African storytelling. And for us filmmakers, even despite, for example, we heavily also rely on financing, let's say, from European countries, we need to sort of stand out and stand up and sort of give out stories that are impactful and that treat Africans with dignity, not to fall in the trap of cliches or trying to appease a certain audience. Like Ramadan said, for example, that stereotype of having an African dictator, they are more than that. Those stories, there are so many, those stories have been told previously. And we're at this very moment where we can change things, we can change the narrative, even despite, and this will take a lot of collaboration between, especially African filmmakers, and especially encouraging the new filmmakers to have their own voices, to sort of rethink and reshape all the structures in itself. And also kind of trying to crack the whole financial setups and looking for new forms of way of fundraising between, different countries, especially here in the continent.
Thank you. Stephen, I was actually coming straight to you, because having produced a number of both features and docs across the continent, what are your thoughts on this? And further, following on what has just been spoken about, but also how do you think we should be going about trying to raise funding on the continent?
Thank you. Yeah, just to respond to a couple of things. I mean, I think this Ramadan pointed out this question of cultural conservation. Cultural conservation feels like quite a static concept, and culture is dynamic and is changing all the time. But I will say this, is that I think I've built up a lot of resentment over time of paying tens of thousands of dollars to British and American and European archive institutions. But recently we did a film where we used the fair use principle of archive use, and it saved us $80,000. And it was quite liberating, because it was kind of saying to all these owners, we can use your material without paying you. And it felt quite liberating to kind of be able to do that. And I think it is a way forward for documentary filmmakers who are using archive to use the fair use principle, because it does overcome a major obstacle in us being able to reflect on our history and our countries and other countries. So I think that's the one thing that it's, to me, once you've done that, it's hard to look back and go back to paying these people all this money. That's the one thing. The other thing is that I think that this, just to respond a bit to Jean-Marie was saying about how we kind of forced into these African co-productions, and they often can be counterproductive. I agree, I think they can be counterproductive, and often the funder has one agenda, but we've got our own agenda, our own agendas. And for me, what's been really interesting about this journey is being able to find people who I might not have looked for before. So I know, for instance, there are really good sound people in Senegal, okay? And there's some really good technical skills in Kenya, and some great documentary filmmakers coming up in the DRC. So I think even though these things can impose on us, it also can force us into looking for people who we can end up collaborating with on multiple projects. So I do think it's a positive. I do strongly believe that when the majority of the money comes from Europe, it does impact on the kinds of films we make. Maybe not always, but in the majority of cases. And I've certainly been in enough situations where I've had a European broadcaster trying to insist that I have a certain storyline in a documentary that is highly problematic, and getting into fights and walking away from money because to protect the integrity of those films. So I think it is a real issue that we are faced with on a regular basis. But in terms of finding money, I think that we as producers working on the continent, I think that there's money in all kinds of places that if we pull together, we can find. I think that there's the kind of all these new film funds, there's European funds we can access and still maintain control. I mean, something I do always is when we apply to the World Cinema Fund or the CNC Fund, you apply without a European producer attached. And if you get the money, you can then select a European producer. Whereas if you apply with them, it gives them a lot more power. So I think there's a lot of ways like that where you're able to apply to certain European funds on your own as African producers. And if you're successful in getting that money, you have changed the power relationship with the European producers, where you actually have something in your hand. So I think there are those kinds of ways. I also think that we're in an era, and it's much more tricky with documentaries, where I'm certainly starting to see more very wealthy Africans, entrepreneurs, who now call themselves philanthropists, who's starting to give money to film or invest in film. I think that whole side of things is opening up. In the last 5-10 years, there's a lot, what I've seen is a lot of very rich people who kind of want to have a legacy. They don't just want to be known as being rich. They want to be known as contributing to society in some way. And often they'll start off with like more basic needs like health, education, etc. And they start drifting into arts and culture. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to raise funding for our films also. And we need to do that. We need to kind of build confidence with people who support our films on the continent that, this works. These films can be successful, and you must tell your friends and your colleagues, and we want to create more of a movement. I mean, we don't really have a system in many countries. If you look at America, is very big on individual investors and philanthropy because there's very little state support. In Europe, there's less philanthropy because there's so much state support. In Africa, we are, there isn't much state support. So I think we do need to look at philanthropy, and it comes with its own challenges, but we need to start finding more African philanthropy in our work without impacting on the content that we make.
Okay. I have a question to ask, which I'm going to throw out to the panel, and whoever feels ready to answer it, around how we'll be doing these cross-border collaborations as filmmakers. How does the legal frameworks, we live in very different countries across the continent, and let's use the example of the fact that if you are in South Africa making a film about LGBTQ issues, you can do it quite easily, you can access funding, you can tell the kind of story you want to, but the minute you're trying to do that across Kenya and Uganda, you start battling in terms of how you're going to tell the story, what are the legal regimes in terms of story that permit you to tell story across those borders. We don't quite often talk about this in terms of cross-collaboration, and I'd love to have your thoughts on how we manage as African filmmakers, and your thoughts. Yeah, anyone up for that? Quietness. Ramadan, can I ask you?
Well, it's quietness because for a South African, can I just take a step back, if you don't mind, please?
Sure, please go
THANDI,
ahead.
is you asked earlier on when you asked Stephen about the way forward, and for me, a way forward, first and foremost, is for us South African producers to put pressure on our government to put emphasis on those treaties, right? I think for me, it's an embarrassment when we have our president who's always talking about African Union, and yet at the same time, when we are dealing with practicalities on the ground, nothing happens. But at the same time, taking from Stephen, he mentioned this whole thing of philanthropy. I think what is lacking for me is this shift in our focus and rethinking as African filmmakers across the board, whether you're dealing with feature or the documentary. I don't think we have resolved the whole thing of treating film as a business. And I think it works against us in the African continent when we always look at money as something that I take from someone and not want to pay back. So it affects my thinking as to how do I look at film. And part of the failure, if I'm allowed to say, to a certain extent, of African cinema not having moved or shifted to another level is because of us filmmakers refusing to think business. And lastly, on that issue of philanthropy, I think it's also time when we filmmakers collaborate with people who are economists, help them understand the potential inherent in our industry. There's, I mean, all of the panelists have said there are funds out there, there are many opportunities out there, but what is their return on the investment? At the end of the day, I'm sorry, we cannot shy away from those issues, however painful they are, that we don't want to face those realities. And I believe it's time that filmmakers collaborate with economists who can put together some kind of funds. But at the end of the day, we must pay back. And this is applicable in South Africa. I find the danger of always relying on taxpayers' money and not seeing the responsibility of paying it back. Now, to come to your last question, an example that you use, which is a very good one. It's a very good question about the LGBTQ and where how do you collaborate between South Africa, it's true that you will be able to get funding for those subject matter or stories in South Africa. But you as a South African filmmaker, you cannot go to Kenya or Uganda because you will be arrested. So you are faced with those dynamics. And at the same time, we shouldn't see them as being negative. It is our role as filmmakers to say, then you collaborate with a Ugandan filmmaker or producer, and you don't go there and see yourself as some kind of a savior. And of course, you will get arrested, but let it be the Ugandan or Kenyan or wherever, whichever country you're dealing with, find ways of making those stories. And it's possible. We shouldn't use those legalities as the means of preventing us from doing our stories. It's possible. But of course, you won't get money for those stories in Uganda or Kenya or anywhere else. But I would say use whatever you can use as opportunities in South Africa and elsewhere and tell those stories. But at the same time, we need to be careful with those stories, because Europe will want to see those stories. They will want to fund those stories, but with a certain eye that can be very suspicious. So us obtaining money in the continent in order for us to tell those stories is important.
Thanks, Ramadan. So outside of just storytelling, let's also talk about, as producers, which is what we are, we're always dealing with the admin and the back end of the hard work of actually pulling all the legal frameworks together to tell these stories. As we start co-producing across country-wise, we sit with different legal regimes. I'll use an example, very simply. For example, advertiser funding. If I'm producing a show that has got a lot of sponsorship involved in it, and it's a co-production between Nigeria and South Africa, the legal regime in Nigeria, and as we're talking about these potentially formalized co-productions as we move forward, the legal regime in Nigeria around my ownership of IP, the way I can bring third-party funders who are not content producers, but let's say advertisers into the framework, is very different from South Africa. It's very different from Kenya. How do we, as filmmakers working across these borders, make sure that we understand those legal frameworks and try and understand how we ease it up for filmmakers to work across it? It's a tough question. I know it's out there, but you're thinking in terms of how we ease it up and how we go about moving to where it becomes easier for us to, from a legal perspective, co-produce across territories. Jean-Marie, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thought on that, and also thought on what you said before that I didn't have a chance to react to. We are in a situation where filmmakers, when you look at the history of cinema on the continent, cinema was supposed to accompany the state building of these many countries on the continent. And in many places, this is still a work in progress, and there are so many failures in many places. And when you talk about LGBTQ issues, or even when you even mention homosexuality in some countries, you end up in jail, because in law, in some countries, like in Cameroon, homosexuality is in the law. By law, it's a crime. You end up in jail. So cinema has been there also to contribute to bringing freedom, to making society a more open society for everyone. So there is also the economic factor. How do we sustain? How do we live as filmmakers? How do we transform society with cinema? So the filmmakers are really in a very difficult place, because the transforming of Africa has been facing a lot of problems, especially for those who want many African countries to be where they are, and especially many countries in Europe who are found in many Francophone countries just a place where resources can just be taken away and nothing being left in the country. So when you were saying that the ownership of the film have to remain in Africa, but the ownership of the resources, the material, everything, none of it is even remaining in the continent. So the idea that by living in the continent, you are having an ownership of something is fine. But those who are living abroad also and who are African are fighting for the liberty of this continent, like many people fought, and the liberation of the continent is still an ongoing struggle. That's why I also believe that when we talk about the issue that can go from one country to the other, we are not at the same level in different countries in terms even of the jurisdiction, in terms of even investing the money, in terms of the law, because of the corruption. You know, Nigeria and Cameroon now is one of the most corrupt countries. You cannot even go in the court of law to find, you take people there, you never know when that's going to be solved. So it's a very complex issue. In Europe, they have managed to try to harmonize many of their jurisdictions. So that's why how they can work together. But we are still in the place where what is the African Union doing to really bring us all together in terms of having some common basis in which we can even do business? So these are questions that also are important to address, because cinema was supposed to help move us into that. But now we have got into cinema as a business. But how do you make business where the rules are not clear, the rules are not there, and people come only to take and go, take and leave, and people locally who are in charge of the state are just facilitating those who can give them some money to do all these things. So for me, it's a question. I sound pessimistic, but you have countries like Cameroon, they can make films, but you make film and you are not even sure that even when you distribute the film within the country, you might even have any money from the distribution of the film in the country, because the distributor, well, he takes the film and he never pays you. And because he's part of the regime, you will never get your money. So how do we deal with all these questions?
So can I ask you a question on that very topic? You raised the AU. I mean, are we as filmmakers actively lobbying at the AU? Are we out there trying to make sure our voices holistically are being considered in terms of the engagements, the discussions they have there? We know that other industries and sectors, like, you know, the environmental sector, the motor sector, will actively go and lobby to make sure that on a continental level, they've got some input into how we're working across borders. Should we not be as filmmakers on the continent doing the same thing outside of just inside our own countries? We very often are in countries we don't have the ability, as you say, to lobby. Is there space for us to become a lot more active at a continental level, and very specifically within the framework of the AU? Or do you think it's just a lost cause and we should try and be doing other things?
No, it's not a lost cause. It's just that we had some leadership that was not efficient. I think Ramadan probably followed more what happened with FEPASI going to the AU and trying to have a platform, trying to lobby. And we know that there is even an Pan-African fund, but the communication, nobody knows exactly where is that money. The communication is not being done. So I know that there have been many people who went to the Addis Ababa to lobby so that the fund will exist to produce within the continent. But that's the only thing I know, and that was maybe in the mid of 2015, 2016. But ever since, we haven't heard much about it. So maybe other filmmakers have heard about it, but we have been lobbying for years to bring the FEPASI to the level where there can be a fund to fund African films within the continent. And probably Ramadan or Stephen, maybe they followed more of that, because I know that in Kenya, there was an office, or there's something happening there, but I don't know much more about that. Maybe they know more.
Ramadan, your thoughts in terms of the AU and how we should, if we should be engaging as African filmmakers, and how we should be doing so?
Well, you use a very interesting example that for me is not comparable. For example, you said
I know. I
the
said cars and
automobile.
environment. I
Yeah,
said cars and environment. I was just trying to highlight the fact that they're lobbying out there, and should we be doing the same more than the actual sectors?
yeah. So if for me it's an issue of where do the pessimistic and truthful viewpoint that Jean-Marie just briefed is also a situation where, for us African filmmakers, to have a single body that is financially enriched with possibilities for them to go to the AU and lobby, where do these funds come from when filmmakers are struggling to make their individual movies? We do not even have, the irony with the continent is we have an organization called FEPASI that Jean-Marie just mentioned, but it was formed as an organization for filmmakers in the continent. But the weakness is, without having national organizations who would empower this continental organization. So you then have one country, which is Burkina Faso, that has the tendency of financing FEPASI as an organization. South Africa tried as well some years ago. But all these failures as a filmmaker body or bodies to have the resources financial to go to the AU and lobby an organization, unfortunately, that is so heavy. When I say heavy, bureaucratic, that it's like it requires 5 years to have one policy going. So nothing happens in this organization for us, the ordinary people on the ground. So FEPASI as an organization has been lobbying. People have been going to the AU. It's true that there is a fund, but the people who go to the AU are oftentimes governments, like our Ministry of Arts and Culture is the one that's going to go with the civil servants, but not taking any filmmakers. So whatever is discussed in the AU with our Department of Sports, Arts and Culture does not come to us as filmmakers, where we are informed as to what was decided. So, and this permeates the entire continent in terms of information. So it's true that, yeah, we do not move forward because filmmakers do not have financial resources to run organizations who can then go and lobby on our behalf. But again, I think it's also totally unfair and at the same time scandalous when we expect the AU to be the one giving us a film fund, when that very organization is funded by the European Union, that very organization is funded by the Chinese. So there's a contradiction here, that we are asking for the AU to empower us, what, with Chinese money, with the European Union money. Yeah, so for me, it's problematic as a discussion.
So I want to go back to the question around the legal regimes, cross-country legal regimes, and I think that's where my question was coming out of. Is there a way for the AU to assist filmmakers in effectively allowing for cross-border legal frameworks for filmmakers, which is not in place at this point in time? So yes, there's the issue about creating a Pan-African Film Fund, but there is also potentially a role that is more on the legislative perspective to make it easier for filmmakers. And do you think there's a role for the AU to do that? And do you think filmmakers should be lobbying for that legal framework to be put into place across the continent?
I would say not to take too much of in terms of the platform. I would say starting with bilateral, for me, is the way to go. Mm-hmm. Between one country and another, and so forth and so forth. But to talk of harmonious, what Jean-Marie spoke earlier on in terms of his example of the European Union, where they would have one legislation whereby they all respect. Unfortunately for us, if you have the AU doing that with all the countries, and yet when you go to Ghana or Nigeria, you are confronted by a soldier. Your first protocol is a soldier. What does that soldier know about the legal issues or implications that you are confronted with as a filmmaker? Are you going to show him the AU document? Right. So for me, a way forward is bilateral agreements, whereby when you go to that country, at least, of course, the way things, my experience, work in the continent, unlike us in South Africa, where we don't need our Ministry of Arts and Culture if I am shooting a movie in anywhere in Joburg or Cape Town or in Durban. I don't have to go and see the mayor. I don't have to go and see the premier. Whereas in the continent, you will need to go and speak to the people at the top, the hierarchy, right? So for us, South African oftentimes do not understand how some of these things function in those areas, where our way of doing things in South Africa are not going to work, because you will be coming with your arrogance of how things should be done as per your country. So there you go to the Minister of Arts and Culture, you inform them in terms of what you are going to do, and so forth and so forth. They then give you a letter, which letter you then are going to show to the military in the streets. If that military is a kind person, will allow you. That military has the right, as per my experience, to tear that paper and throw it away and says, I don't care about this paper. So you are confronted with all those issues, unless you have the money to pay a soldier. You go to the military base, inform the commander in the military base to say, we are doing this, here's the letter. And of course, if he's kind enough, will allow you with a corporal or somebody to escort you. Those are the legal parameters that we South Africans at times do not understand how things work in the continent. And this also applies in Algeria, for instance, where we were shooting all over. You have to go and report to the nearest police station with those 3 or 4 letters from different departments. And the commissioner in that police station will then inform all the necessary policemen in the streets to say, there is this group with this particular vehicle, they are doing this, please, you support them. Those are the legal things that you are confronted with from the basic level.
Great, thanks, Ramadan. Stephen, I see you have your hand up. We need you, unmute, please, Stephen.
Sorry, it's probably better with me muted, but here I go. The first thing I wanted to say, there's a few points I wanted to pick up on, but I think the first thing I wanted to say is that I think it's very difficult to generalize when talking about the legal situation across 54 countries. I think there's dynamics in each country and they're changing every few months. There's a constant back and forth. For me, what's important as filmmakers is that we do our homework and we do proper pre-production. I mean, I know we shot a film in Tanzania, in Zanzibar, just before lockdown, and we spent 1 year in pre-production, when we produced Viva Riva, we did 2 years of pre-production because we knew we had to build relationships and also do training and support. And the problem with a lot of international crews, they just rock up and think they can start shooting tomorrow, and they're going to have all these problems. So I think it is very important to do your homework and do proper work on the ground. I think on the bigger legal question, I think it's, I think it must be noted that, we've been lobbying the National Film Foundation for over 20 years, many people, to try and put money in and put structures in place to collaborate with the continent. And now we are in the process of hopefully signing 3 co-production treaties. So while it's taken 20 years, I think it is progress. And I think those co-production treaties can set a legal framework. That's not to say you need a co-production treaty to co-produce. You can do it without that. But in terms of the kind of complex legal issues when co-producing with each other, normally the kind of protocol in co-productions is that the majority country becomes the jurisdiction. And like we've tried to move away from that on the continent, because sometimes, normally we're having equal partnerships, but sometimes the legal framework within a country is such a mess and is pretty corrupt. You can kind of buy a judge off with an iPad, basically. And so I think one has to be really careful to use legal frameworks that not all parties trusted. So what we're doing more and more is there are these international arbitration, film arbitration organizations like IFTA and others that you as co-producers can sign with them, and they will arbitrate any disputes, etc. And it's not linked to a legal system in a particular country, but you sign up to abide by their code. And I think that's one way around it. I mean, I don't think we can rely on the legal systems as it is. And I think that's also linked to, another point is that, let's face it, in this business, there's a lot of dishonesty, there's a lot of lack of transparency. If I had to list all the co-producers in Europe who've still owe me money or haven't been transparent with what they've done, it's a long list of people. And I think more and more we're starting to use collection agents, that all the money goes into a central pot and is managed by a third party. So I think that's another way. Just with what Jean-Marie was talking about earlier about, if you give a distributor your film, will you ever see the money? We've all had that experience. And what I try and do more and more is I won't give a film to someone unless they give me money up front, even if it's less money, even if it's a small amount of money, at least I won't feel bitter afterwards. So I think that's really important for us as filmmakers to insist the value of our work, and the chances of getting ripped off are very high. And I think we need to insist on that. But I don't think we should, something you brought up early, Thandi, about LGBTQI stories and the different legal framework in South Africa from elsewhere. I don't think it's just about the legal framework. I think it's about the political framework is often more important, because I know, having worked on 2 films in Kenya on that subject, and both were banned, Stories of Our Lives and Rafiki. When we set out to fundraise for Rafiki, I went to all the funders and broadcasters in this country, in South Africa, and they all gave me the same answer. They all said no, and they all said the reason they're saying no is they do not want to upset another African country. They did not want to put money into a film that could have a negative impact on their relationship with another African country. So I think the allegiance of people, funders often, is more with governments than with the filmmakers. And I think it's not a nationalistic thing. It's almost like there's a political foreign affairs issue that's ruling that. So, but I just generally, I feel relatively positive, because there's the whole question of the AU and lobbying the AU. I mean, this is a conversation that's been going on for decades, okay? And we haven't really got anywhere. for me, what makes me really positive is I think this is happening organically, is we're seeing all these funds that are funding films across Africa. And there's probably, I haven't done a count, but there's probably like 12 or 13 countries with film funds that are supporting film. And that's like over 20% of the continent. And a lot of those funds are supporting not on a nationalistic basis. And I think out of that new kind of sector of African funders, who are, some more than others, are accountable to filmmakers in some way, I think therein lies a powerful kind of alliance of all these funders and money with filmmakers. We can have some power to start putting pressure to leverage that to find more funding for our films.
Thanks, Stephen. SAITABAO, your thoughts on this as a young filmmaker? I think the rest of us on this panel are almost all past our sell-by dates. I have to speak for myself included. So your thoughts, you know, as a filmmaker who's coming into these regimes, who knows they've got another 20, 30, 40 years of making films. What are your thoughts? What are your wishes around? Let's talk about the legal framework first before I move on to other things.
Yeah, so basically when it comes to sort of like the whole AU and lobbying, mine would be sort of like a hypothetical, you know, way of approach or a positive way of thinking. Fingers crossed that it happens in terms of, because for example, right now, the AU has established the, you know, African Continental Free Trade Area. So these are some of the things where we can sort of establish, you know, the arts and culture as an industry in itself, because you find most of the industries compared, whether it's, you know, agriculture or energy, they always have some sort of, you know, special advisory, you know. So even from the arts and culture, filmmaking sort of have a Trojan horse, making it sort of lobbying from the inside, meaning sort of we have to, you know, follow the whole bureaucracy, all that stuff, but have a sort of an ally in such positions. So where some of these grievances or some of these ideas and suggestions can always reach to the topmost, highest level and can be paid attention. Now that is probably seeing it from a very positive or hypothetical, but it's possible because, for instance, especially in Kenya, we've had positions where we've had people lobbying, for example, when it comes to the change of law, when it comes to the filming. For example, we have a law which is it was used during the colonial time when it comes to film, stage and play, sort of it needs to be revised. So we had people sort of lobby for it. And this is through individual collective organizations. So moving on to the framework, especially the legal framework, for example, I know especially in Kenya, it's always a very sensitive issue when it comes to the LGBTQ kind of films. Like, for example, I remember Rafiki when it was banned, right? But there was a sort of movement, especially because it was considered for, you know, one of the representation for Kenya at the Oscars, where the ban had to be lifted, and people got the opportunity to watch the film in theaters. And so this is sort of a collective move where also you had people rallying, especially Kenyans, saying we need to watch this film. And this also meant for, you know, people trying to convince the government that filmmaking is sort of an art. This is something, you know, it is not based on political. It's trying to see a different narrative, different point of view, right? We might not always agree on certain issues, but can you see what this form of storytelling can do, can change, you know, just to respect people. So I feel very positive, and I feel very you know, optimistic, especially in terms of legal framework, where also the people are making their voices heard, especially the audiences, and also kind of changing the government's perspective, because you just have a few certain people in higher positions making this decision, will ban this film, and the actual reason of banning the film is not valid enough. So these are some of the ways that, you know, we can always navigate, and feeling really optimistic about.
the future. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move towards wrapping up, and I wanted all of us to have a discussion around what advice we want to give people who are looking to start co-producing across the continent. What's your big advice around that? And let's start with Jean-Marie. What should producers be looking at? So two questions I have with you. Two questions. What is your big advice for young producers starting to work across the continent? And the second question is, how do you go about finding the right producers? I think that's also key. So those two questions, if you could frame those.
But I would say turn to Stephen. He knows everything about producing. For me, what advice to a young producer? I don't even know if I'm at the right place to give advice to anyone who wants to make a film today. Me as a producer, for instance, most of the work that I do is help a filmmaker to clarify his vision, to really make sure that he makes the films he wants to make. That's my part as a producer. But the advice to give to a young producer is to watch as many films as possible, because one of the major problems is people haven't watched enough films, and many times people come to you with an idea of a thing that they have invented, the road to cut the butter, and suddenly you say, but this other film, so to watch as many films as possible. And this is something that is lacking, the culture of cinema. And what else can I say? And also to read. There are so many things on internet that I don't even know all of the elements, and to also go through the history of this continent and to understand where we are at, because of course I might sound pessimistic because I ask always the question that bothers, but it's not that I don't feel optimistic. I'm seeing so many young people becoming producers. When we started, there were hardly any producers, any African producers. And there are many training, many schools, many workshops that are training producers, and that's really great. And I think it's going to lead us to having many people producing films. But still, the major thing is the question that everyone to ask himself: why do you make films? Of course, it's a business, but also you need to ask that question intimately before starting, because if you just make it for business, maybe there are many other businesses you want to make money. But I don't know if it's making film that is going to help you make money, unless you want to make, I don't know. But that's what I can say about that.
Okay. Thanks, Jean-Marie. Stephen, I think you are placed, having done so many across the continent. What advice would you give producers looking to co-produce? I loved your comment about the fact that you really need to concentrate on pre-production and get your ducks in a row. But are there any other key advice points for you? And then also, how do you go about finding the right co-producer on the continent?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with Jean-Marie about watching films. I think we don't know each other's cinemas well enough. And I think there's still a lot of stigma attached to our films where we're not putting enough effort into finding each other through our different films. So I think, I saw recently Lemogang's film, This Is Not a Burial, that came out in South Africa, which I think is an absolutely brilliant film. There are so many young filmmakers who I came across who hadn't watched it, weren't planning on seeing it, were just like not engaged with it. And for me, I think it's a very important work of cinema that we should all see. And that's just in our country. So I think, how much does Kenyan filmmakers know about West African cinema? How much does South African filmmakers know about North African cinema? And vice versa. I think we're too influenced by America and Europe, and we are not focused on appreciating and analyzing and debating our own films. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that there's no easy way. I think it's like whether you're co-producing with other African countries or producing, I think the most important thing is tenacity and having a thick skin. I think normally on every project we do, I pitch it to over 100, 150 people, and maybe 4 or 5 of them say yes. But there's all those other 95% of the time of rejection. So I think a big part of this job is not letting rejection get to you and using it as a strength towards your next proposal or pitch. So I think that's really important. And then I think the question about why you're making the film and why do you need to co-produce? If you can avoid co-producing, you should, but there's got to be a compelling reason that all parties need each other and there's kind of mutual respect of what they need each other for. Otherwise, it's just a fake architectural plans for a house that is going to collapse. So I think you've really got to ask yourself those difficult questions about, why do I need to do this? Why do I want to do this? In terms of finding producers, I mean, there's no easy way. I think one has to do due diligence. I think every time, if you're looking for someone from a country or, you know, look up who they worked with, write to people, phone them, ask them what it was like working with them. Most people are quite open about that and will be relatively honest about that. And I think you have to, you know, before you get married to someone, certainly you do a bit of, you know, you've got to feel like you trust them. Well, one should. And before you go into business or start a partnership with someone, you're going to like want to know things about them. And making a film with someone is, the copyright of that film will outlive us all. And one has to feel one's going into that relationship with one's eyes wide open. So I think that you have to check them out and contact people they worked with to do proper checks on people. And the other thing is, like, it's back to that tenacity thing, is to kind of never give up. I believe with every film, there's someone out there who it's in with their interest to support that film. And you've just got to find them. So there's no film that no one is interested in. There's always a way. So I think one has to like leave no stone unturned and keep at it. But I think the starting point is what Jean-Marie said, is like, we need to know each other's cinema and each other's work. It's really important.
Thank you, Stephen. SAITABAO, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I'd just like to echo what everyone else has said, which is also very great advice, especially for a young filmmaker like I. Yeah, I think the first stage is for example, the whole pre-production. I feel, you know, fostering that relationship when it comes to bilateral is very important, no matter how long it takes. Just give it time. I know sometimes we tend to be very impatient. We want to immediately work on this film, but it's a very important and crucial stage especially when you begin making a film. And also watching a lot of African cinema, because I feel most of filmmakers heavily tend to rely on European or American cinema, but just also to dig into the archives and try and find more African cinemas. And also when it comes to telling new stories, I think also young African filmmakers should sort of try and visit the past, take a time machine like way back in the past, and, you know, find all these rich and cultural stories that there is. And some of these stories have not been told, and they need to be told, especially at this very point and this very junction, because as time moves on, all these stories kind of tend to fade away. So it's also part of your responsibility as a filmmaker to sort of be the custodians of such stories and transition them maybe to the now and to the future.
Thank you so much. Ramadan?
Yeah, I will also echo what has been said. The way forward for me in finding a producer is the young filmmaker need to, I agree that first and foremost, watch and watch and watch and watch and get drunk watching movies. It's a first step for me. And in selecting the producer or co-producer that you want to work with, you need to do your homework. What does that producer do in terms of the kind of films that he or she makes? And you also need to say, my film would speak to that producer's way of thinking. So your research on that producer is, for me, paramount. You can't go with the movie that you are making, which does not speak anywhere in the filmography of that producer, right? So that for me can be very embarrassing, hence the rejection. Something which is very difficult, it's a deficit as well in the film industry. I mean, Jean-Marie and Stephen did echo this. Finding somebody you can trust is not an easy one. Trust is a deficit in the film industry. But hence your research in order to minimize the trust. But you never know that you might also become the victim as well of, yeah. The issue of, I don't believe that you should use language as something that you are saying, no, this, where you say these producers are French producers, so they're not going to be the kind of people I'm going to work with because they are in France. But no, you go anywhere and everywhere, whether is it France or Germany or Holland, anywhere, you will find somebody, as Stephen said, somebody somewhere there might take on your project. Lastly, for me, as a young filmmaker, you are looking for a producer, please do not go to someone and says, I'm making this movie to change the world, to change my society, to change my community. Please go and write your own book, and possibly it might change somebody. But there's no such a thing as where you think that the producer will sit in front of you or read about you and assume that, wow, this young man or woman is wanting to change the world. Nobody has. So rather say to the producer, I want to make this movie to make money. Be naive. At least it's something that somebody can listen to, right? And yeah, I suppose finally is watch and watch and watch and get drunk.
Great. And I'm going to wrap it up
Movies.
here, but I'm going to ask you each one question. What is your big dream for African cinema for the next 10 years? And I'm going to start with SAITABAO on this.
Wow, my dream in the next 10 years, I think mine would be the film industry to already have grown and fostered, and it's, standing on its own, especially being a well-respected industry compared to other industries where filmmakers are able to sort of make a living out of their craft, and also the types of stories that are being told by filmmakers. So I feel the industry, for me, a dream would be great storytelling that cuts across throughout the continent and making it sustainable for filmmakers in order to make a living per se out of this film industry.
Great. Stephen?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me next, but if on the spot.
I can go if you want to, Stephen.
Go ahead, Jean-Marie, if you want to go next.
Yes, my big dream for the next 10 years is to create a house of documentary, almost like in Cameroon and in my hometown, a place where I would gather most of the documentary films that have been made in the country, and place where young people could come and pick up a camera and want to tell a story, a place where transmission can be possible, because one of the biggest lack is that the first generation didn't transmit enough to the younger generation. The young who are coming are not receiving enough elements from the olders, and suddenly they are just thinking that looking at cinema just as something coming from somewhere else and not associating it with their own everyday life. Cinema will not change the world, but we notice that by representing what is going on around you, there might be a change, a possibility to transform society in that way. So that would really be my dream, to create a space like that in Cameroon, especially in Cameroon, where in the last 50 years, things have been going from bad to worse and getting so terrible. And that's what my dream would be. Not to make a film that goes to the academy, because really, for me, it's not really important. It's more to see the emergence of so many people using the tool of cinema to speak, and to speak with that.
Ramadan?
Let me save Stephen. For me, we know that there's so much of poverty in the African continent. I wish, and cinema for me, it's the only medium industry that has a potential to create jobs, an industry that has a potential to work towards fundamentally alleviating poverty. Because when you are making an example, a feature film, you employ a certain number of people. And it's the only industry in the world, I'm saying this with confidence, that within 3-4 weeks of pre-production, you are able to employ 50 to 100 to 250 people at one go, right? So can you imagine a dream where we are able to produce in every country at least 30 movies, documentary and feature films, and whatever, web series and so forth. Every year we produce those. That will make an impact, in my view, as a dream in the African continent. Not situations where you are planning something for 5 years, 10 years in order to make things happen. But the potential for me to alleviate poverty, to make things to, as SAITABAO just said, where we gain respect. And the repercussions are so positive because people are going to see this industry bringing food on the table, right? And not becoming something that ends up in the archives, but something that they are able to say, we see it and we are able to bring food on the table and so forth. So that for me would be a dream, that every country produces at least 30 to 100 movies, and we become a continent that consumes cinema. And I'm hoping that as a dream, whatever is produced in South Africa is seen in Nigeria, or whatever is produced in any country in the continent. It must just be available to every citizen.
Stephen?
Okay, I suppose I have to say something now. I think for me, it's a few things. I think the one thing which is really important is for us to realize our own power. And the reason I say that is that, filmmaking has always been seen as like part of the arts, and it's they're telling narratives and they're like doing their own thing in the arts. But actually narratives are part of everyday life and part of every profession, whether it's an engineer or a politician or a person in advertising. People are using narratives all the time to explain things. And I think we as filmmakers have, my dream is that our importance in society is recognized as like being central to telling narratives. And that sounds like quite lofty, but I think, I feel quite optimistic, because if I look at 10, 15 years ago, there were very few film funds around, there were very few producers around. And I'm not saying that because I think producers are the answer to everything, but I think a lot of filmmakers were working on their own and were struggling. And I think with producers can help build infrastructure and pipelines for our films and economies. And so today, in the future, in 10 years' time, I would hope that those pipelines are really well established, where we can watch each other's films, and there's an economy in Africa for African films that can fund African films, and we are not totally dependent on outside funding. And that's a big thing to say, because we all know what's going on now with Netflix, and the studios are all sniffing around the continent. But I do believe that we can build an economy for us to make films that are creatively, artistically provocative and challenging, and politically provocative and challenging, and find audiences for those films. So that's my story.
Thank you so much.
Just one little thing I want to add that I forgot to mention about the archive. We have been complaining about the archive and complaining about it. Actually, I made a film in '92 with almost 20 minutes out of 90 minutes of archival footage that I managed to get all over. But today there is one thing. We are looking for archive everywhere of things that happened 20, 30 years ago. But what are we doing about the image that we are producing now? These images are going to become the archive in 10, 20 years. And nothing is being done really to keep and to preserve these elements that are going to be of so much value in a few years' time. So why don't we really start also by building the archive of the future with the work that we are doing, with the film that we are doing now, to make sure that these films are going to be preserved and be available for the future generation in 20 years' time. That's what I wanted to say.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Marie. That's a good point to end on. I know we're reaching the end of our session. There's a comment from our machine on Facebook that asks exactly that question. She says, thank you for all of you for saying watch as many African films as possible, but where do I access them? How do I access them? Even if I want to pirate, I can't find them on any Pirate Bay. So I think that's going to be key, is as you're saying, how do we archive, how do we pull that together? And if we're wanting filmmakers who are filming now and future filmmakers to access that, how do we go about making sure they have access to those films in the future? I think that's just key there. We need to keep that in mind. And I agree with you, Jean-Marie, that we need to be, as filmmakers, talking about where we put these resources into and who holds the keys to those. Any last words, Stephen?
Yeah, just to respond to that question about how to access it. I mean, you can see a few of us have got gray hairs here, and so
mine is everywhere.
We've been watching and making films for a long time, back when there was VHS and there was no internet, and one found ways to see films, and often it took a long time, but you'd write to someone, you'd meet someone, you'd try to get to a festival, they would send you a VHS. And now today I understand, if you go onto Netflix, there isn't this incredible selection of African cinema. But if you dig enough and ask people who know people, you will find what you're looking for. So there's no like one button you can press, but you have to dig a bit, and it's worth it.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for an excellent session, and thank you to Encounters for hosting it. Please watch the films at Encounters. There's some extraordinary films from the continent and across the globe, and it's important that we support our African filmmakers and our African stories, specifically in documentary. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your morning with me and giving us and our viewers the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
See you.
all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.